I want to start by welcoming everyone to A Williams Life. Our conversation today is with fellow classmate Pam Hawkes. And while you may not know it, I suspect many of you have encountered Pam's work over the years, especially if you spent time in the Boston area. In her long career as an architect focusing on historic preservation, Pam has helped transform such iconic buildings as the Cambridge Public Library, Symphony Hall, and the former Charles Street Jail, now known as the Liberty Hotel. And that's just a short list of her many high-profile projects in New England and beyond. And the beyond part of our conversation will include talking to Pam about her work in New Mexico on the home of George O'Keeffe, one of her childhood heroes. Then we'll travel halfway around the world to Africa and discuss Pam's work on an all-girls school in Tanzania. Just one word of advice before we get started. I strongly encourage everyone to visit the Williams Life website, 75creates.com, and review Pam's work either before or during our conversation. It is truly extraordinary. Before we get to your work, let's start what we usually do at Williams. What brought you to the Purple Valley?
Well, looking back, it feels like a wonderful random accident because I was pretty much set to go to Brown. I'd had a older friend and neighbor who was at Pembroke, and so I applied to Brown in spring of my junior year and actually was accepted in September. And my mother said, "Are you really sure this is where you want to be?" And so we set up a college tour of northern New England, and I think we stopped at Middlebury and maybe Bennington. But I had a fantastic interview with Lauren Stevens, who was Dean of Students, who was really supportive, seemed to really appreciate who I am and what I could bring, and talked to me about the environmental studies major. And then we went out and we went to the art museum, the college art museum, and I heard four guys singing a cappella in the quad and discovered that there was a bakery on Spring Street. And that was pretty much all I figured I needed to be happy there.
A croissant in the morning to tide you over.
A chocolate chip cookies in the afternoon, too.
You were in the first class of women that attended for 4 years. Looking back, what was that like for you?
I think for me, it was, for the most part, a really positive experience. I certainly heard about stories. I had friends who were one of my best friends from childhood was at Princeton, and she had some not so great experiences. But I really valued the chance to have so many guys and have good friendships. And I actually spent a semester at Smith experiencing that kind of an environment, and didn't find it that much more supportive, and really missed the kind of casual relationships that we had.
I want to talk to you a little bit about this webinar I listened to again that Martha Coakley had with fellow members of our class, all women. And while they would all say they would attend Williams again, they talked about the challenges. And I want to quote from those interviews. And here's one set of quotes. I didn't fit in, felt like an outsider or an imposter, which made them women express the fact that maybe they didn't feel good enough to attend Williams. Does any of that resonate with you? Because these were all very highly successful women.
Well, absolutely. And for me, it was less because I was a woman. I had Julie Winkler and Chessie Hill were my roommates, and they'd both gone to private school. So I was convinced I was the only person who hadn't gone to private school, that everyone else had everyone else had friends already. Everyone else had a secret language. They knew what clothes to wear. And they'd gone to AP classes. So I felt like I really had to catch up. I listened to that podcast too, and I just wanted to cry because I thought about all of us who were there, feeling apart and searching for connection. And if we just shared what we were feeling, we might have had a different experience.
Did you seek out those connections and conversations?
I didn't per se. I think I was afraid to admit that, what I was feeling. And I think also that one of my regrets about my experience at Williams was that there were so many more men than women, that I had great relationships with the guys, but relatively fewer relationships with women. And we weren't sitting around in our dorm rooms talking about things. We were out doing stuff with classes and activities and things like that. So it really never seemed to be a time where we sat down and said, "What's going on with you? How's it going?"
There was a slightly different theme from the women expressed in the podcast. And I'll quote again. It said, one of them said, I felt I was part of an experiment, a guinea pig, being part of that class. And when I talked recently to a black member of our class, he used the same words, guinea pig experiment, being a minority at Williams. So does that resonate with you at all?
I mean, I can't say to a certain extent. And maybe what I was thinking about this also, just that there's also part of me that has actually welcomed being in a different environment. My parents took me to Europe when I was 13. I'd grown up in a small town with very little diversity. And going into these foreign countries, realizing that people in France actually spoke French. Like, I just started studying French and they used, they rolled their R's in that weird way that our French teacher was trying to make us do. That I think I also found that in this larger world, there were more opportunities. But there's also a part of me that also then stands back and wants to try to kind of figure out what's going on. Mm-hmm. So I think I spent a lot of time trying to not feeling like it was my job to figure out how to succeed there. Yeah. And in some ways, I think that's also why working in a male-dominated profession like architecture was part of taking on that challenge.
Wow. In terms of the feelings that some of the women expressed in the podcast, they use the word anxious and in a couple of cases, depression. Mm-hmm. Does that strike a chord in any way?
Yeah, it does. I think that in retrospect, I was really lucky I was in the Purple Valley and not in Providence, because for me, I could go out and walk down to the pond or go out and walk up in the hills or get out on my bike and kind of leave that behind and come back again. But I didn't know then about how much connecting with other people can make a difference for that.
I'll conclude with one other observation from the podcast. As Martha asked everyone, were they strivers or survivors? And I wonder where you would put yourself.
I guess I'd have to call myself a striver. That for me, kind of buckling down and doing the work, I was really aware that I had a fantastic opportunity. And so studying as hard as I could, auditing classes when I could, making the most out of it was the way that I chose to, found to succeed. Less so necessarily relationships and leadership, which is something I had to learn about later.
One other thing, on the webinar, people talked about the reaction of some upperclassmen. And there was a T-shirt, apparently, some of them wore that said, co-eds go home. I don't know if you saw that T-shirt or not. Did you experience any attitude from upperclassmen? I
think we knew it was there, and we certainly knew kind of where it was coming from. I think that I credit the college with also having outlawed fraternities before we got there. So I feel like compared to Princeton or Dartmouth or other places like that, the social situation was a lot more fluid and maybe even, which I think was helpful. And I, certainly found much more welcome than rejection as far as that went.
Just want to segue a little bit from Williams to what you ended up doing with your life. You were originally a printmaking major, and then you had a conversation with a professor that changed the direction of your life, really. Tell us about the conversation and what happened.
Well, it was probably 2 days before we graduated, and we had a party, dancing and dinner for the whole class. And Ted Sandy, who stopped me, I think, on his way out, there were faculty there too, and said, I'm leaving Williams to become architect for the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and I think historic preservation might be something that would interest you. And I've been trying to figure out why he would have said that. And I'd taken his American architecture course and his modern architecture course. And for the modern architecture course, one of the assignments was to design our own house. And I had a fantastic time with it. And I think maybe that experience and talking with him about that. And then also my senior show was drawings and prints of spaces on campus that had been transformed in some way, like the studios in Goodrich Hall, which used to be a chapel and then became art studios, might have clued him in to the fact that I was looking at those kinds of things and thinking about them.
Have you ever thought what happened if you hadn't had that conversation?
I haven't, actually. I know that I had no clue. I didn't even really put it together. I was panicked. I burst into tears after I left, as we were driving the hairpin turn on Route 2 out of the valley, because I had no clue what I was going to do. And fortunately, I went back and kind of regrouped and ended up doing volunteer work for both the local landmarks nonprofit and the art museum, and then applying to grad school with Ted Sandy's help.
Well, other than this conversation, which changed your life, I'm always interested in where people get their inspiration early on. And I know that you talk about an early experience where you wandered through a 19th century fort. Tell us about that experience and how it also affected your life.
Well, Fort Williams was about 90 acres on the coast of Maine, a 10-minute walk from my house. It was built during the Spanish-American War and pretty much abandoned after World War II. So by the time it was sold by the government to the town in the 1960s, the windows were broken. Everything was overgrown. It was a huge magnet for every kid in town. It was creepy and scary, but also a place where you could wander through and see envelopes or rusty bed springs and think about who were the people that lived here and how did this place come to be. And I think that sense of mystery stayed with me. And then actually, Sheaf Satterthwaite taught a course in environmental studies, which I must have taken probably my first year, where we were required to write about a place. And so I researched that place. And I learned how to read landscapes and places through their history. So suddenly I went back and saw that place with a whole new set of knowledge about where the ships came in and where the munitions were kept, and a whole level of knowledge about that really intrigued me. And I realized that you could do that at any place, whether it was a state in England or a suburban lawn in California. And that was something that he really turned my eyes on to.
I'm just wondering, kids have a lot of experiences when they're growing up. I'm just wondering why that one in particular, could you describe it in great detail in terms of what you saw and how you were impacted by it? Why did that experience stay with you as opposed to others who didn't?
Well, I think it was a couple of things. One is that I had to divert from there. I had a grandmother who was really passionate about history and heritage, and who used to take us out and have us pretend that we were pilgrim ancestors or whatever. So she was already had shown me the stories in those places. But then this sense of, I think also the contrast between what must have been then and what it was now, to walk and feel the crunching of glass under your feet as you kind of wandered through these barrack buildings, and also the sense of loss and the sense of waste. And I think that the sense of wanting to make a difference in that was what really promoted me to be thinking about doing that.
And you had an emotional reaction to that, and that turned into sort of a lifelong passion.
Yeah. And I have an emotional reaction to most places that I get to work on. Often it's more, I get more intrigued and excited before we do stuff. Afterwards, when everything's fixed up and perfect, sometimes it's also exciting, but not as full of possibility as it is before. We've chosen one path to go down as opposed to the beginning when it could be anything.
There's always another project and always more excitement to come.
Well, and ultimately in that particular place, most of the buildings were demolished. Oh. So there are probably 5 or 6 left. They decided to make it a recreational area. And I think the sense of waste of that, the incredible waste of energy and investment in that, was something that also really resonated for me.
I want to talk about 3 of your projects that we agreed on in advance to talk about. But set the scene for us. Give us a sense of your design philosophy and approach before we talk about these individual projects.
I think for me, there's always been a tension and a balance. I started out in preservation and then I went into architecture, never expecting that actually design would be such a strong appeal for me. And so my interest has always been in making history part of the present. That I love historic house museums. I've been privileged to work on a number of them, but I guess I'm less interested in the kind of painstaking restoration and more in creating places where everyone can experience heritage and making it look like it belongs in our time and reflects the values of our times. And there's a real tension there often. And again, I think that's part of this negotiating in new environments, that how is it that I understand a place well enough to find the right way of making it speak to the future.
Well, let's go to some examples, and these are ones that you wanted to talk about. So that's your philosophy. We can talk about how it comes to life. And one building you wanted to talk about was the Crandall Public Library. So tell us how that project came about and what you did.
The Crandall Public Library is in Glens Falls, New York, which is about an hour north of Albany. And it was originally designed in 1931 by Charles Platt. It's a beautiful brick Georgian building, sits in a park, which Platt also designed, and looks a lot like a mansion. And the one historic photograph of the interior that we had was of 6 white guys sitting in suits and ties in Windsor chairs reading newspapers. It could be a men's club or, any kind of very relatively exclusive place, even though it was a, small building. But Glens Falls, actually, the library serves 3 communities, 3 blue-collar communities with paper mills and a history that's today pretty challenging. And the library is serving families, providing them with books and games and parenting skills. And so this Georgian building didn't necessarily reflect the kinds of services that they offered. And it had been added to over the years. It had 15 different levels, which was a challenge for book carts and baby carriages and anyone with a wheelchair. And for us, the biggest challenge was that we were the 3rd architect that they had hired. And the first hurdle to get over was that it was an $18 million project. $12 million was going to be funded through a public bond to be voted on in a referendum. And so we knew that the design had to be approved essentially by the communities. And we did what we do architecture, but often designing the whole process, especially when you're working in the public realm, is really important. And we would, whenever we went up, when we started the project, we would set up a morning meeting with the staff and building committee, usually an early afternoon meeting with the trustees, a mid-afternoon meeting with the press, and then an evening session with the public. And showing them pretty much the same thing or variations there, of that. And starting by actually inviting the community to tell us what they wanted. I think before we've even invested ourselves in a design, to hear from them what did they want. And they talked about being able to access the park, being able to access, easy to access parking and other things around it, a place that was welcoming. And so we actually created an addition that came out from the park to the main street. So you could actually walk in off the main street at grade level with counters that looked a lot like Starbucks or, the kinds of bookstores that were morphing into coffee shops those days. And also lots more glass overlooking the park so that people could see out into the park and also see in if you were walking by in the park. And it was a success. The referendum was passed and the towns voted it. And we got ready to go into the next phase of design because it's pretty normal for a project like that they only go through schematic design because you don't want to invest in the complete project if it's not going to fly. And we started thinking about what materials should it be, brick, stone, terracotta, how are we going to keep it within budget? And we made some revisions and came back and did our usual routine. And the headlines the next day were "Stop the Library's Ugly Plan."
Wow.
The press accused us of baiting and switching. That they
promising one thing and delivering something else.
And we thought we were improving it. And so, and they even had an online poll. So you could vote for whether you liked the old version or the new version. And I don't remember which one won, but we spent a little time swearing at everyone and being frustrated. Why didn't they understand?
You don't seem like the swearing type.
Well, in our studio, you could start the stomping of feet, perhaps, and then realize that we just needed to explain to people what we were doing. And so I have a fantastic project manager who was very skilled with graphics and drawing, and he did a series of diagrams that showed how the elements in the new building were relating to the old building. And we came back and we explained, and ultimately were successful.
Did the pushback continue, or did it pretty much go away after you did the communications?
It actually pretty much went away. I think we may have had a few people who had particular peeves, but by and large, it was an incredibly supportive community. And we were lucky we had a local architect who also had their ears to the ground always and would say, you're going to see this person and they're going to say that. And that was, again, almost a translator for us. Glens Falls doesn't seem like a foreign country, but anyone who's working from out of town faces that.
Yeah, you are an outsider.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Tell us how you measured success, not just that you had the project completed, but things happened, circulation went up. So tell us about your measures of success and how you achieved them.
We finished in 2008, so it was actually just as the recession hit. And I think proved in many ways what the value of the library was. I think they doubled the number of visits annually and issued a lot more library cards. And that, for me, is the greatest level of success. I mean, it won awards. Also, I must say that the reporters who took us to task earlier wrote wonderful reviews when we finished it. So, and there's a real satisfaction in that too, for sure.
So the media did eventually come to your side.
They did.
That's great.
Yeah.
Let's switch to another project now. Maybe less high profile in some ways, but deeply meaningful to you. And it was the work you did on George O'Keeffe's home and studio in New Mexico, which I know was deeply personal to you. So how did you get involved in that project?
Well, I should start by telling a little bit about the building, which O'Keeffe actually owned 2 houses in Abiquiu, New Mexico. And in 1945, she bought a kind of half-ruined traditional adobe home right in the center of the village. And in the process of restoring and renovating it, she actually made some modernist interventions, which included 5 windows that were about 16 feet wide, much, much larger than the traditional size of an adobe opening, which is typically 3 or 4 feet. And no one was quite sure how those were being held up. And then she also covered the traditional adobe with cement stucco, which was a modern material and, supposed to be maintenance free. But if there are any roof leaks or if water comes in from underground, the adobe actually can fall apart and you'll never know it because the cement stucco doesn't show cracks. And so
until it cracks and breaks down.
Until it, ends up in a pile of dust. And so the conservation staff at the museum was concerned that that might happen. And they called up my colleague at the chair of the department at Penn, where I was teaching at the time, and explained what the issues were, and said they were looking for some people to help them actually plan a process, a study to try to understand what was going on, and also write a grant to the Getty Conservation Foundation. And they contacted me and a good friend of mine who's a conservation engineer who I teach with and work with a lot. And the two of us teamed up and helped the museum write a grant, which actually wasn't successful, but they were able to use it to get funding from a private foundation. So we were able to start the work, and it involved both looking at various ways of analyzing and testing to try to kind of see through the stucco, which was not easy. And but working with engineer from Colorado and another architect who was a specialist in Adobe from Texas, and bringing our minds together to look at the Adobe and then also look at the larger risks around the sites. It was surrounded by national parks. And when I went back last year, the site was surrounded by those large forest fires that were in the Santa Fe area. So we were looking at everything from how did the fire trucks get from the volunteer, fire department to the site, to how would climate change rainfall, winds, weather, and things like that, which I find really intriguing these days to kind of, in some ways, imagine what the risks might be and what we can do about it.
Now, when you were working on this, George O'Keeffe is a childhood hero of yours. Was she in your head when you were doing this work? Did you hear her voice or somehow think about what she might be thinking about the work that you're doing?
Well, I always start every project by trying to understand how and why it came to be. So we had the great good fortune because she actually wasn't on site during the 3 years that the house was being restored, because Alfred Stieglitz had just passed away. And so she was here in New York settling his estate for 3 years. And a friend of hers, Maria Chabot, was in charge of the work. And so there was a ton of correspondence between the two of them that I was able to read. It's been published and also was available with the museum. And so I could read what they were saying, compare notes, understand, look for that little clue that says went to Santa Fe today to talk about how to support the windows. And today the steel for the window in the studio came. So it was like, yes, okay, we've got that. It also, for me, the whole issue of the Adobe was a really interesting one because not only was it a conservation issue, but it had artistic elements too, that she decided in 1959 that she'd had enough, that she loved the texture of the Adobe. She talks about the women coming and replastering every couple of years, and her description, it's like touching someone's skin almost. And the natural finish is cracked. It's like almost like not a lizard skin, but has an incredible texture to it. But she said, I can't go through redoing this every couple of years. And also the local source for the finish had gone away. So she said, let's stucco it. And she went to Ghost Ranch, her other house, so she wouldn't have to watch it happening. And that was one thing, her decision to do that was an important turning point for us understanding the site. But another historian who has been doing research for the museum noticed that she said she bought the house because of this door in the patio, and that she had to have that. And she painted that door about 24 times. But after the house was stuccoed, she only made one more painting. And she didn't actually paint the texture in her paintings, but it was what drew her eye to it. And so for us, the interesting challenge is, do you honor her decision to cover the stucco, or do you perhaps try to restore the finish that originally attracted her to it?
And what did you decide?
We were able to punt on that because the museum was not interested in taking up. There are actually 2 layers of stucco, and it's a big project. And what we've done is to set in place a number of questions for them to ask when the time comes to replace the roof and do other things like that. But for me, it's those challenges that are the most interesting thing about what we do. Sometimes there isn't a right answer, or sometimes you have to make the answer and say, these are the reasons why I did this, and hope that future generations agree with you.
But this is a unique case because you are thinking not of just any owner or a group of owners, you're thinking about a particular owner with a particular mindset and a particular artist. Yeah. And that's what you have to consider.
And she was a kind of down to earth, practical person. I think that's why she put the stucco on. And I think she would have said, "What are you thinking? Why are you quibbling about this? Just keep it the way it was." But it would be nice to be able to ask.
Where did your fascination with George O'Keeffe come from?
Life magazine published a cover article on her when I was 16. And I tore out all the pages and pinned them up on the wall, the red poppies and the black iris. And I'd always loved flowers. I was fascinated by this woman who was an artist who didn't have a family. She was not known as a homemaker or a socialite. She was known for her art. And I think for me, that was one of, few kind of heroes that I could look to. And I think looking back now, I'm also aware that she painted and drew space. That those flowers were flowers, but they were also, you were drawn into them in a way that is very spatial. And she drew, she painted buildings also. And so I wonder how much of what she was seeing also resonated with what was ultimately of interest to me.
Did working on this project change your perception of Georgia O'Keeffe?
It certainly deepened my understanding of what she had done and accomplished, of how much she designed her life. In addition to doing her painting, she designed her clothing. She had very distinctive suits that she wore. She was very much aware of her own image in a time when, of course, there were very few women at the level that she was in her career. I think I also got to know her as a person. One of the remarkable things about what we were doing is that two of the people who had worked for her are still working at the site.
Wow.
And so Peter Lopez, who is the site manager, would talk about sitting with Ms. O'Keeffe in her bedroom, which is this tiny room with an enormous window that looks right down the valley, and reading to her at night because she had macular degeneration, so she couldn't see, and she would read aloud to her. And to know, to see this incredibly human side of her was also really, really moving.
So you really picked their brains, the people who knew her.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was hard. I mean, how could you not? And to take a tour of the house with one of them is like, is going behind the scenes in a way that's really remarkable.
Well, let's now shift to a different part of the world, a pro bono project that I know you're working on in Tanzania. Could you tell us about the project?
Sure. My husband Scott and I had decided to take a year off in 2012. It coincided with me leaving Boston and moving to Portland, and also with a sailing trip from Portland to the Mediterranean. And when we spent years dreaming of it and talking about it, and there was always something about taking our yacht through the Mediterranean that was wonderful, but also a little bit made me uncomfortable. And we also used to sit by the news every night and see disasters and poverty and people with far less than we had and say, as architects, we should do something about that. And so we decided that we would have 3 or 4 months while the winter season, not good sailing, that we would use to volunteer somewhere. And I looked at a lot of different options from the UN and Architects for Humanity, but ultimately we came back to a project that had inspired us a few years before that. There was a couple in Portland, Maine, who founded a nonprofit. He's the director of the Art Museum in Portland. She teaches African studies at Bates. And they had lived in Tanzania for 2 or 3 years in the 90s, and then gone back in 2006 to a village that had been very special, where they'd gotten to know the elders very well. And the elders said, the little kids have to walk too far. They can't go to elementary school. Will you build a school for us? And they got a dozen of their friends here in New York to donate and built a school with 16 classrooms and teacher houses, and ultimately a health clinic and doctor's housing. And friends connected us, and we got together with Aimee Basir, who's the founding director, and she said, "Oh, it'd be great it'd be wonderful if you went to Tanzania. We don't have anything for you to do because we haven't raised the money at the time, but there's a place you can stay, and you could look at what we've done and tell us what we could do better. We've been doing a lot more renovation projects. We always run over budget. We run over schedule. You could help us manage stuff." And we said, we sort of each had faith in each other. She had faith that we'd be able to do something worthwhile. And we had faith that we would get something out of the process. And just before we were ready to go in January, they were approached by a local politician who said, we really need a girls' boarding school in this district. And so we went with the request to design a campus for 400 girls and spent 3 months researching what schools were in I had to first figure out what a primary school and a secondary school was, what were their customs, what did people expect, work with the district to see what their expectations were, understand the campus, and ultimately developed a master plan by the time we had left, more or less.
Are there unique challenges working overseas in Tanzania as opposed to working in the U.S.? And what are they?
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, first of all, the language. Everyone speaks English. They learn English in secondary school, and so it is very much the language of government. But it's not the language of intimacy, I would say. And we tried, but learning a language after age 60 is really, really hard, especially one that's not something you can necessarily pick up easily. It's not like French or German or even Chinese. So that was one thing. And then, I mean, I'm only 10 years later beginning to understand how much we didn't know because we came in with, even though we came in open to having our expectations changed, we didn't realize how much us being in the room changed how people behaved.
Yeah. Tell me more about that.
I think it's, again, something I've just been looking back at, that looking at our early meetings with the district, for example, we have meetings just like we'd have in Glens Falls or Cambridge, where we put out ideas and say, what do you think of this? And we didn't get much feedback. Everyone said, oh, looks good, just fine. And we didn't know what to do with it. When Aimee, the head of our NGO, came, she would joke with people in Swahili. We couldn't do that, although we can at least say hello and how are you and how's your family. But I also know that as a representative of someone who's going to come in and do a project and bring the money to do it, and as white people and Americans, that we came in with, wearing a big hat. And I also have learned just recently about, that most of these people learn in the traditional schooling to question your teacher, to even correct your teacher on something is punishable with, a switch. And so I guess I would love to go back and say, what could we have done to make it okay for them to share doubts? What could we have done to make them understand what we were doing better? Instead of everyone saying, yes, looks good, how soon can it get built? Which is, in reality, I think what they were probably thinking.
I know in your work, whether it's in the U.S. or overseas, you respect local culture, customs, and ways of living, which you've been talking about. But how did you work on those aspects specifically in Tanzania? What were you trying to respect so that your project would succeed?
There were a couple of things that I can think about specifically. We were really lucky because while we were there, they actually did get funding to do renovations for a primary school near where we lived. And so we got to see the construction crew at work. And so the construction traditions were actually our first revelation because they built with no power. They would haul the stone in on a bicycle. They would dig the trenches by hand in flip-flops. But they did amazing work. They built the base for the floors was what they call hardcore, which is essentially granite boulders that they split with a pickaxe and then fit together like a mosaic. It's beautiful. And then they cover it with concrete. And so we found a way when we did our first new buildings, which were the science labs, to actually expose that on the base of the buildings so that we could celebrate that craftsmanship. The other thing we did was we'd been living in the traditional houses there are mud brick and thatch roofs, and they're colored like the surrounding dirt, and they're soft in the landscape. And the new houses that are being built are cement block and tin, with gable roofs, and they're big and shiny and white, and they stick out like a sore thumb. And so we actually designed 2 teacher houses for this first campus that were a play on the house we were living in. But the house we were living in, the roof would be 100 degrees in the middle of the day. And we were reading a lot about double roofs as a way of cooling. So Scott actually figured out that by adding some trusses on top of we would build a regular gable roof with 2 sides, and then we would add trusses on top of that and add another layer of the roof, which would actually create a 4-sided, much more gently arched roof, much more like the thatch, and also ways that the hot air would escape rather than coming into the house. And he worked it out with the guys on the site, and then they built it, and some of them actually ended up doing that in their own houses, which we think is the kind of ultimate seal of approval.
So it sounds like you learned a lot from this.
Oh, absolutely.
And lessons you could take for your other work as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think lessons for life, too, larger life. You know, people always say, oh, this was such a wonderful thing you did. And we got so much more out of it than whatever we could contribute. I think partly just appreciating how much we have and how little it takes to make a difference in a place like that.
Yeah, and we talk about how do you measure success, and there's one detail from this project that I understand that the girls who live in the dorm do better on national exams than girls that don't. Do you know why that is?
Well, it's about, what kid in America longs for the opportunity to do homework. But these girls, they get up at 5:30 or 6, they dress, they go into the dining hall and study for 2 or 3 hours before classes start. And then they come back and do sports, and then they study before they go to bed, often 9 or 10. And if they were not living at the dormitory, and right now the dormitory only has 50 beds in it. So not that, and the school has 600 or 700 now, I think. They're walking back and forth to school, which takes an hour or more. When they get home, they're expected to gather water and firewood, help with the small kids, probably help with cooking. And by that time it's dark and you can't do homework. So it's an opportunity that is, and it's also safe, that many parents will not send their girls to school because of the risk that they... Along the way, absolutely.
Before we move on, will you be going back to Tanzania? Do you see a future for you and Scott there?
We do, in different ways. We actually went back in February and had a chance to see the dormitory compound completed and do some check-in with the girls, with the teachers, with the authorities about what was working and what wasn't working, with the idea that this might be a prototype that could be built at other secondary school campuses. But we actually were also engaged by another nonprofit, also based in the Portland area, which has been funding tuition for girls in secondary school for the last 10 or so years in the Arusha area. So they purchased a piece of property in December, and we got to see the site, actually meet a local architect who's terrific, and then talk with them about building a headquarters for them that will include housing for up to 36 girls when all the girls come from secondary school to participate in leadership programs that they have. It'll have sports fields because they do a lot with gender-based violence and teaching about birth control and things like that through sports, which is fantastic. Housing for the director and volunteers, and a library for local kids who come and are able to use textbooks and things like that. So
yeah, it sounds incredibly rewarding, both for you and Scott and for the people you work with. I'm wondering if we take a step back from these 3 projects about things that keep you up at night, things that you worry most about. I know the projects vary from town to town, country to country, but what are the biggest challenges that you've had to face, and what do you worry about?
Well, we always worry about whether the roof leaks and whether the mechanical systems
You should
work.
come to my house.
Yeah. Well, everyone has a story, right? I think for us, particularly in Tanzania, it's this tension between how much innovation to bring versus working with the team. I think we feel really lucky because we're working on small enough projects, and for me, a lot of studies. So much less risk involved in that than when you're actually building something.
I'd like to talk to you a little bit about your role as a woman, as an architect. And I read in one of the descriptions that you had said, quote, you'd been in too many construction meetings as the only woman. And I wonder what that felt like.
Well, construction, I think for any architect, unfortunately, construction can be an adversarial process. And I had nightmares before the first project I was doing construction administration on. I think that the field in general was also pretty male-dominated. I was incredibly lucky, in retrospect, that both after I finished preservation school at Columbia, I worked for 3 years with a fantastic woman architect in Washington, D.C., Mary Airline, who was smart and no-nonsense and elegant and, was basically said, this is the way we're going to do it, taught me a lot about how to be a professional. And then 2 years after finishing architecture school, going to work for Ann Bea, who was also a fantastic role model, and to be able to work with her to build the firm. I feel like I backed into architecture, that I went to preservation first, and then I said, well, I need to know about this architecture stuff so I can do preservation better. Design was never part of my kind of vision, but when I got to school, it was what I loved, and it turned out I was good at it. But to excel in design in the world of architecture is big. You have to put yourself out there and be willing to say, I'm doing it and I'm doing it the best. And I think in our practice with Anne, we also kind of backed from preservation into design so that we excelled by knowing our stuff. And I think for many women, that's the strong point. You just learn more and know more than anyone else. And eventually they have to give you the work. And that we took on, for example, working on museums because the museums had to balance the buildings and the collections, and we could figure out the science, and we could get the people who knew what needed to be done, and we get everyone to talk together, and then we translate it for the clients. And that ultimately morphed into renovations for museums and additions for museums and brand new museums because we built up the experience that way, starting with the stuff that we knew.
Well, there was some gender imbalance in your work. Maybe it depends on whether it was construction or design or wherever. How did it impact your work, this gender imbalance?
I have to say, again, I was so lucky to have found the mentors that I did. I mean, did spend a few years in male-dominated firms, and I got out not because it wasn't explicit, but I know that if I had stayed there longer, I would not have accomplished what I did. That I was always with women who said, we can do this, you need to do this, you need to get licensed, you need to be involved civically in the profession and take leadership positions. And I think in that sense, as with at Williams, that I felt that the difference of being a woman was more of an asset. That, we were coming into a time when they said, well, let's invite them because we should at least have one woman in our selection, the 5 finalists. And then you could go in, and once you had a chance, you could go in and win the job.
With the best idea and with a strong presentation and a strong personality, you can win out.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you can't get in the room, then you can't. And I think that's what I'm so aware. The statistics are still tough for women. I think it's nearly equal graduates, but much, much lower percentages of women who are licensed. The percentages for minorities are even smaller.
Let me get to another aspect of your work, which I found interesting. What little I know about architecture, it's highly technical with computers and animation and this kind of thing. And yet you still value hand drawing, place a high value on that. Tell us about that. Why that's still part of your life in this highly technical world.
Well, it's interesting because the things you mention are tools. So architecture is no more about triangles and parallel lines and computers than writing a novel is about a typewriter or a word processor.
Right.
So for, architecture is about looking and listening and taking what you've heard and translating in a way, making connections work, finding something new, and in my case, something old, and bringing them together. It's interesting because, I just went to the Georgia O'Keeffe show at the Museum of Modern Art, and it's the title of it is "To See Takes a Long Time."
That's very profound.
And well, it is, and it's because. And we were hand drawing in Tanzania because that's all we knew. Neither Scott or I had done any computer work before we went to Tanzania. All of the other more educated folks in our office would do that. We'd do loose sketches to start with. We'd go back and mark up what our incredibly talented staffs had done. But I knew maybe how to open an AutoCAD drawing, but that was about it. And so when we were in Tanzania, we were off the grid, and, you couldn't, if we'd wanted to work on computers, we would have spent all of our time running across to the health outpost where they had a solar collector, and it took hours to recharge our laptops. But it's also, we drew and we drew and we redrew. And for me, there's a muscle memory that comes both in seeing and putting it on the paper. And then in putting it on the paper again and again so that you begin to understand what's the relative size of the children's library versus the circulation desk. And that then becomes, then you are able to manipulate that and make it your own. And also I know now, because I have learned how to use AutoCAD, I know that when I draw a line in AutoCAD, it has a beginning and an end and a particular length. When I draw a line on a piece of paper, it could be anything. It could be an inch long or 100 feet long. And then I can look at it and I can turn it upside down and I can make it be different things before I begin pinning down exactly what it is. And I think that for me is a real difference. I'd be the first to confess that I know that people are doing amazing things. And that because I'm less fluent in that language, I'm not able to. But I do value these old-fashioned ways.
Yeah. Is AI going to be a part of architecture looking forward? I
think it will be. I think that what I talk about drawing and redrawing is what AI does. I know that AutoCAD, I can draw a line and then I can copy it and I can mirror it and I can scale it and I can do all these things with a kind of click of a button. But then the question is, what do I have when I've finished? Yeah. And I think the larger question is how much learning that we don't know about is happening while we're doing that, making mistakes and redrawing it. And, that if we can't, if the machine is going to do that, how do we learn? And I think also the entry-level positions, the drafters that start out, no one starts out knowing how to put a building together. You have to do it through trial and error. It's no different, I suspect, than writing, and anything else. And it's going to be very interesting to see what happens.
Is having a liberal arts education and training valuable for what you do? Absolutely.
Yeah. As I've been teaching and mentoring students, I'm very aware that I took a very untraditional path. I was 30 by the time I was through architecture school and licensed. And I know, Scott was an architecture major in undergrad. And I feel like every place I've been has contributed to what we've done. And everything, the thing I love about architecture is that also I keep learning from each thing, I've learned. I never took a history course at Williams, even though the history department was fabulous. I'd love to go back and be a history major. But I've learned about freed slave who ran a barbershop in Natchez before the Civil War. I've learned about J.P. Morgan, all different aspects of American life through what I do. And I think that's because I had this really broad grounding in understanding how to hear and listen and look at places in different ways.
You've almost defined the value of a liberal arts education.
I hope so. I mean,
let me ask you, you've had a long career, successful career. Are you as excited about projects now as you were when you were starting out?
Absolutely. Right now we're working on the only living Shaker village left in the U.S., which is totally cool.
And where is that?
It's in New Gloucester, Maine, so 45 minutes from where we live. And they're re-envisioning themselves for the 21st century. Their motto is, "You are welcome."
Wow.
And that includes people with disabilities, people of different gender identities. It's not what you would associate with Shakers, but it is, for me, absolutely inspiring. I think also, I used to think when I had just out of grad school that I was going to be out of a job. I worried that I was going to be out of a job in 10 years because we had all these great federal programs. We were doing all this restoration. Everything was going to be fixed in 10 or 15 years. But of course, we've learned to value things now that were built in our lifetimes, which is very scary. And we've also learned that there are incredible stories that we've completely ignored. Native peoples, Black African-American peoples, women, LGBT history. So there's so many stories that are yet to be told. I think I'm also aware that some of those stories are not mine to tell. And so now the opportunity for me is to be much more of a mentor and a facilitator than to be actually doing the work myself.
Right. Let's end on a couple of personal questions. I know that you work for these large firms, were very successful, and then 10 years ago you started Scattergood Design with your husband, Scott. And I'm wondering what made you take on that transition?
Well, it was partly a practical one, which is that I was practicing in Boston and Scott was practicing in Portland. And we realized that Scott's 8 years older than I am, that the number of weekends that we could spend together was actually limited. And so moving back to Portland for me was an obvious choice. And we also made a decision to have a different kind of practice than we'd had. Both of us had helped run these larger firms. We spent most of our time marketing, worrying about whether or not the people who were working for us would have jobs, and managing, dealing with clients and everything else, and not getting to do the design, or in my case, the research and writing that we really loved. And so we said we're going to set up an office with no employees. Right. And that's given us tremendous freedom, and also said, let's try to make the world a better place while we're at it. And we've managed to do that. And
you can do this at our age because you have the wisdom and experience and the contacts. So you can do the work and not worry about the marketing.
We're incredibly lucky. We've mentored a number of younger professionals, and they all want to do exactly that. But it's much harder when you're starting out, and especially knowing the financial burdens that they all have that we had in smaller amounts when we started out.
What's it like working with Scott, your husband?
Oh, well, it's how we came together. Architecture brought us together, but there's no question that it is the most challenging part of our relationship. He was the first architect I worked for, so he was passionate about what he was doing. He showed me how to build models and be part of that. He is so smart and creative and curious, and I've always admired that. And he's been a fantastic mentor. But it turns out that in 30 plus years away, I've discovered that I'm fairly opinionated and a bit stubborn. And so working that together can be a challenge. To be honest, we work about 36 inches apart. But
close enough to throw things at each other.
Absolutely. And but we also have different interests and strengths. So quite often we'll be working on completely different things. And that, I think, has also been a secret to our success, is that we each have a chance to kind of run down the road a bit on our own. This project that we're doing in Arusha is one where we're working more closely together. So we're learning how to work together. We're getting some good coaching along the way, and there's no question that it's also incredibly exciting to be working on a creative endeavor like that with someone that you love and respect.
That's great. Something that I know you like doing together is sailing, and it's summer, and so I think we'll end on your next sailing adventure. Where are you going this summer, and how is that going to go?
Well, we're hoping to get about 4 weeks, and ideally get to Nova Scotia. Meg Race, my college roommate, is in Nova Scotia with her husband, Paul Halley, and we had dinner. They came down for dinner this spring, and we promised that we were going to take them out for a sail. So we'll see whether that happens. Also, the Maine coast is so beautiful, and there are places you can go and be away from everything in incredible beauty. So
I think you should moor your boat up there and have Meg do a nice portrait or painting, watercolor of
absolutely,
of you.
Yeah. Well, that would be great. That would be great.
Anything else you'd like to comment on in terms of Williams, your life work, and what the future holds?
No, I think I feel so fortunate to be doing something that I love and to have lots of other things that I'd love to get back to more art, some writing, more time with friends and family. That's, I think, my biggest hope. And also just so aware of how many opportunities that I've had, that the chance to give back, whether within my profession or within the community or foreign places, has really been something that I'd love to keep doing.
All very exciting, and a lot of interesting projects ahead, and more sailing. So with that, Pam, thank you very much. I've enjoyed our conversation, and it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you, Gordon. It's been a pleasure, too, and I'm looking forward to the next ones as well.
I want to thank Pam for making the trip down from Maine to be part of our conversation today, and I also want to thank everyone for tuning in to what I found to be a fascinating conversation. A reminder, if you want to put Pam's work in context and truly understand it, please go to A Williams Life, which can be located at 75creates.com. And this is Gordon Earl, and I look forward to our next conversation and hope you'll all be with us then.